All right, we are starting back in the Torah portion series, and this is the 34th weekly portion known as Bamidbar. We're starting the book of Numbers. And Bamidbar in Hebrew literally means in the wilderness. And in case you're not yet aware, I definitely prefer the Hebrew title in the wilderness over the book of Numbers that we have in English. I don't know if that's going to ruffle anybody's feathers or not, but I just kind of have to chuckle when I think of it because you go through Genesis, you go through Exodus, and the reading's not too terribly bad. You can get into the stories, it flows pretty well. You get into the book of Leviticus, book number 3. It gets a little gritty, it gets a little rough. You talk about sacrifices, the things that pertain to the priests. You get a lot of laws, you get a lot of diseases talked about, and you're like, well, maybe things are going to pick up a little bit. I wonder what the next book is. Then you find it's Numbers, and it's like, well, maybe I'm better off studying leprosy after all. But again, this is the 34th portion in the series. And of course, the reason why this is called Numbers is because it really starts off with Israel being counted, the 12 tribes. And what they do here is they disqualify the Levites from the Numbers contention. And since Joseph is a tribe split in half between Ephraim and Manasseh, they go basically all the way from Reuben all the way through Joseph's 2 half tribes in Benjamin, again disqualifying the Levites. And they count the number of heads, they count the number of souls in Israel that are within the parameters of the military age and military service. So, to put it in modern speak, our type of vernacular, if they were within schooling age or about to be married, they're not held in consensus. If they are past 50 retirement age, we're not going to hold those numbers either. By the way, this is just men, and this does not include the clergy. This does not include the priests. And by the time they go through and they total up all of the people of Israel, we come to the running total of 603,550 people in Israel. And this isn't the first census that Israel undertakes. As a matter of fact, the first one we find of Israel is back in the book of Genesis when they're coming to Joseph in Egypt. This is one of 10 census counts that you will find in the Old Testament. And I believe the next one after this is actually in Numbers 26, where we kind of find something interesting. And the reason I say this is interesting is because when you take a look at Israel leaving the land of Egypt, and by the time they make it to the promised land, it's a 41 year span, right? The majority of those 40 years actually transpires in the book of Numbers. And just as the case with blessing, just as the case of provision, things become more. There is an increase when true blessings are applied. And when you look at the census here, there's 603,550 people. But by the time you get to Numbers chapter 26, we're at 601,730 people. And of course, yes, we did talk about how those who were enumerated, those who were totaled, were of military age. And what do militaries often do? They go into fights, they go into battles, they go into wars. And just as the result of war, people perish, people die, there's death. And while there were battles that had taken place, while there were victories they won and losses they also occurred, a lot of the death that we find actually isn't the result of failed military conquests or even military victories. A lot of the death that we find transpire in the book of Numbers is simply a case of disobedience. A lot of it is Israel receiving a true blessing of nourishment and provision of God, and they spit in the face of that. And that's not me knocking an ancient people I've never met before. We do the same thing in churches today. So don't think it's just going to be a race thing or a history thing. By golly, no. That is a naive thought. As many times as some of my friends and I, it's like, how hard is it for ancient Israel to learn this lesson? The same degree of difficulty it is for me to learn the lesson, 110%. And so while I find it curious, there was blessings given to Israel, they stepped on their own toes a lot. And, they didn't pull the gun out of the holster before they shot. They shot their own toes off. And They spiritually handicap themselves a lot of the way through the wilderness. And I find it interesting too, because you get into the book of Exodus, and once they leave Egypt, a handful of days later, you actually find them at the base of Sinai, where they pledged themselves to be a covenant people. And then from there, they become a covenant people. They next spend like the next 4 decades trying to make it to the promised land. And it makes me think of us in our spiritual journey. We all have our own moments. Like I said, this book in Hebrew, Bamidbar, means in the wilderness. And there's wilderness that each and every one of us have to explore. We struggle with fights. We struggle with turmoils. We struggle with temptation. We struggle with defeat. Sometimes we struggle with victories, as awkward as that probably sounds in the mind. And I feel what ancient Israel had to go through is a picture of what so many of us ourselves have to go through. And I don't feel that this wilderness experience was something that God had meant for all of Israel to perish and die in the way that they did. Because you take a look, 603, 550, that's how many people were counted. By the time, like I said, you get to Numbers 26, they lost between, 1,700 to 2,000 people. And it was a result of their disobedience. Things that, they would take a look at, oh, well, there's giants over here, and like there's all these things, and we're too small to be able to do it. You're exactly right. You're not big enough to be able to do each and everything in life. But they served a God who was able to get them out of Egypt through the signs, the wonders. He proved that he was with them then. And I sometimes wonder if they struggled with God being for them, or they just barely outran disaster. And I feel through Exodus, through what you find in the book of Numbers, all these experiences were supposed to help meld them together with the presence of who God was. After all, we read about the stuff in the tabernacle. That's part of what we read about in the opening 4 chapters in this Torah portion, is the tabernacle and how it was going to function and people's responsibility. The whole thing about the tabernacle was showing that God's presence was traveling with the people. And while they may not have been big enough to accomplish everything that there was to do, their God was mighty enough, their God was strong enough, and their God was powerful enough to give them grace and provision. And they were supposed to learn in a trusting relationship. Sometimes you bring animals or pets into a home, and they're a bit skittish of the people. Why? They're in an unfamiliar territory. They don't know the people they're around who own them or they're with. But day by day, time by time, meal by meal, pet by pet, scratch by scratch, there's a bond, there is a trust, there is a familiarity that is developed between all the parties. And it just seemed like Israel at times didn't know how to bond with their God. And again, these things were written for our example, for our building up. You don't have to run into a brick wall or a bridge at 90 miles an hour to learn how to do that, and you see somebody else do it. You can learn that by example of what you've seen happen on TV. And if you're smart enough, you will learn how to take that lesson and not learn it the hard way. What we find ancient Israel, they've got 40 years in the wilderness. Sometimes they were a blessing. Sometimes they cursed God. Sometimes they got it right. Sometimes they got it wrong. What we find on a large macro scale, we find Christ in the Gospels. He spent 40, not years, but days in the wilderness. He was hungry. He thirsted. There was a temptation that he had to face. And temptation itself is not sin. If temptation is sin, we have a disqualified Messiah. Sorry to put it that way. If that bursts your bubble, you've got to think about it. If you're on a diet and you have all these thoughts of going out and having donuts for breakfast, and after you have lunch, getting a slice of pie along with your hamburger, you have these thoughts, okay, the part of your nature is to want to have the things, the unlimited access. But if you have the patience and you have the strength and the self-determination, the self-control to not do it, you can fight through the temptations to show your worth, to prove your refinement. And thank God that Christ got everything right, to prove himself as to be the one that was sent of God. And a lot of the things that we find in the book of Numbers, there's a lot of overlapping parallels. There's a lot of what I call spiritual liquidity. There's a lot of the things that Israel got right or wrong on the giant scale that Christ got on an individual basis that allowed him to be who he was, to prove his worth, to prove that he was the Son of God, the Messiah. So let's go ahead and look at some of the things here in the book of Numbers. We've already talked about the census that had taken place. I want us to also take a look at Numbers chapter 4. So, in the beginning, we also find the tribes, the allotments, they're being, enumerated. We also find that the tabernacle, there's an arrangement about how there's going to be 3 tribes camping out on each of the 4 sides of the tabernacle, so that's outlaid. And then we get to the stuff about the sons of Aaron, and then in chapter 3, we find where the Levites are going to serve in the tabernacle. And when you're a Levite, it's talking here about, depending on what division you're a part of, you're going to do this. Jobs are being outlined. That's what I've called a couple of my last couple jobs. It's your line assignment, right? So they start learning all this stuff, and everybody's got their own specific job. And I want us to read in Numbers chapter 4, talking about the duties of the sons of Kohath. And Kohath is thought to come from the word Yakah, or it also could come from the word Kawah. And Yakah means to obey. So it's something along the lines of obedience. And then when it comes to Kawah, uh, it could also mean to gather into strength and to hope. And in essence, their idea is of gathering, congregation. You might have heard of the term kahal, which is a very fun word to play with, especially when you're taking a look at what has been translated or mistranslated into the Greek. Perhaps more on that later. That's going to be a sacred cow I'll try to bust a little bit later on. But when you find those qualities among the Kohathites, let's just jump in and see what it says in the text. Numbers 4, verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Take a census of the sons of Kohath from among the children of Levi, by their families, by their father's house, from 30 years old above, even to 50 years, who enter the service to do the work of the tabernacle of meeting. And here's where we start looking at this. This is the service of the sons of Kohath and the tabernacle of meeting. And mind you, these are all Levites. And whenever we find the Kohathites are actually cousins to Moses and Aaron. And it says, this is the service relating to the most holy things. When the camp prepares to journey, Aaron and his sons shall come, and they shall take down the covering veil and cover it with the ark of the testimony with it. Then they, meaning Kohathites, shall put it in a covering of badger skins and spread over the cloth entirely of blue, and they shall insert it in its poles. Then we move on and we transition to talking about the table of showbread. What are they going to do with that? They're going to cover it with blue cloth. They're going to put it dishes, pans, bowls, pitchers that they use for the pouring and the showbread. They're all going to be on it. Then they shall spread over them a scarlet cloth and cover them with the covers of the badger skins and insert the poles. And the same thing with the lampstand, the golden menorah. They're going to take the blue cloth and cover the lampstands, the wick trimmers, lamps, all the trays, the vessels. The whole idea about the Kohathites and what they do, whether it's between that, you've also got the golden altar. Their big thing is to cover and to carry. And when I think of the Gospels, when Jesus talks about not casting the pearl before the swine, when I have a visual representation of my mind of that, I actually think about the duty of the Kohathites. Because if you see these images of people picking up the Ark of the Covenant, throwing it on their shoulders, and them just gallivanting in front of the whole parade of the whole worldly audience, whether it's Israel, whether it's anybody else, that's not exactly what they were supposed to be doing with it. It was something holy, it was something sacred, and it was supposed to be covered up. There was supposed to be sanctity to what is holy, what is separated, what is set aside, what is sanctified, as I'm sure I've already said. Sorry, I'm been up since 2 o'clock this morning. Anyways, but there is a degree of hiddenness that needs to be, in a sense, involved with this. You'll actually read in the prophets, I believe it's in one of the books of Samuel. I like to say in the book of Samuel, because in Hebrew, 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's just one book named Samuel, talks about how the Philistines, they themselves actually had the ark, and it's the event where things were going bad for them, so they decided to send it back. Well, anyways, there comes a point in time where the people decide to throw up the Ark of the Covenant on their shoulders, and they're going to huff it back to wherever. Well, as they get going, they wind up accidentally, essentially tripping, about to spill the whole thing, and one of the guys throws his hand up to prevent it from tipping over. And what happens? The guy's killed, which seems to be kind of an overreaction. I've heard people explain it in sorts. Why was that the consequence? Well, the consequence was because it was an action of hypocrisy. And what do I mean by that? It's not supposed to be traveling naked. It's something that when it travels and transports, it's supposed to be covered up. And that was the duty of the Kohathites. Now, there exists this chance of somebody listening to this who've actually never really heard of the Kohathites before. You might have heard it before, you might have seen it in reading, but you can't ever visualize anybody necessarily right off the bat by hearing the term Kohathite. The reason why, of all the things I could bring up in these 3 complete chapters and first half of chapter 4 that is within this Torah portion, the reason I brought up the Kohathites is because there's actually one who is a lot more well known perhaps than any of the rest of them. And as a matter of fact, he's one of the handful of individuals who, in the entirety of all the 50 plus Torah portions, has a portion named after him himself. And we're going to study it, I believe it's going to be in 4 weeks from now. In Torah portion Korach, or as we say in English, Korah. You see, part of the parameters, the things that's being set up in these first few chapters in the book of Bamidbar, in this book of Numbers, is that everybody who is a Levite, who comes from the priestly tribe, they have their own prescribed duties. Nobody gets off for free. Everybody is coming here and everybody is having their own job that they have to do. And the Kohathites, they're to cover. And they have really probably a more special and more particular job than most everybody else in all of Israel has. You got to keep in mind the Levites, due to their non-participation in the sin of the golden calf, they got to be adopted as pretty much the quote-unquote firstborn to God. So they're already in a special place that all the rest of the tribes don't have that privy to. And the fact that you are a part of the Levites, like I said, that puts you in a point of distinction. And the fact that you are getting the opportunity to work with some of these holy vestments, some of these holy instruments, puts you in a category that very few people would ever even have the opportunity to do, or much less see, much less know exists. But Korah came up and said that wasn't enough. He actually was saying that Moses, that Aaron, they were throwing their weight around. And he kind of put it under the guys, you're doing too much for yourselves. What was he wanting to do? He was wanting to elevate himself in a spot and a position that was never ordained by God for him to participate in. And as a result, it was pretty costly. And like I said, we're going to study a lot of that stuff more in detail in 4 weeks. But take a look at what his name means. And take a look at what happens at his fate. That's another pretty interesting one in my mind. But I kind of feel that that is a representation of a lot of what happens today and a lot of what we find in the churches. There's some people who are filled with a lot of zeal. They've got a lot of fervor. And you know what? It's refreshing whenever you're somebody who's been doing ministry for long form, long time, to be around people who you'd consider new spirit or new blood. You know, it really kind of elevates somebody who's been doing it a while, because sometimes you just, it's part of your wilderness. You get drugged through the consequences. You get drugged through the dirt. You get tired. Here's the thing. We're amphibious. I jokingly say we're amphibious. You go back to the book of Genesis, you have man. Talks about how we're made of the dust of the earth. God, we're made of, people joke about we're made of a pinch of clay. But God breathed into the nostrils of Adam the breath of life. There's a part of us that is given by God that is something that is from the upper in a vessel that is made earthly. And sometimes you're in this earthly vessel and you get tired for A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And sometimes we get people who they want to do good. They want to do great even, but sometimes they don't know what their position is. And yes, of course, we absolutely have to tell them to pray. We pray for them. We pray with them for that spiritual guidance. When Jesus starts talking about the oak, good grief, starts talking about, his burden, his light, it talks about take upon the yoke of Messiah. You would sometimes have a bull who is experienced in plowing the fields. You know how you train a new bull? You know how you train a new beast of burden? You put it in a yoke with one who is experienced and who knows what's going on. And then it might try to go off and might try to do its own thing, but guess what? It's locked in the yoke with one who knows what needs to be done. It knows the job, it knows the chores, and it knows its route, and it knows its place. And as they work together, it's going to settle down. But the one who's experienced, the one who's the elder, it gets to borrow on some of the zeal and the strength of the one that's younger that it's paired with. And Korah, unfortunately, that was not the best of endings for him. And I know we are talking about something that is yet to take place in the Torah portions. I look at it this way. Really, truly, honestly, I doubt anybody who is hearing this is your first exposure to Scripture. I doubt the sound of my voice is spoiling anything for you that you haven't been exposed to or should have been exposed to already. And I feel sometimes it's beneficial as we progress our way through the Scriptures and in these stories, if we highlight certain particular things that are happening now in what we're reading and how they're going to end at the very end, how they're going to wind up being, acting, resulting in, sometimes we're able to work the maze. We're able to find the pattern and work the maze in the middle and find out, oh, this was the consequence. This was the issue. This was the result. And so, while the first handful of chapters of the book of Numbers is a hard and difficult one to get a lot of spiritual liquidity out of, I feel that there are lessons when you pair it together with the Gospels, and once you start getting insights about some of the other factoids, there's some things for us to think about. And so, as always, I thank you for your time. Be blessed.